Joe, and welcome back to my series of reviews for the original Star Wars trilogy. I've covered Star Wars A New Hope, and today we're going to be talking about Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, which many people not only consider to be the best made film in the saga, but also one of the greatest movies of all time. Just like with the last movie, it's hard for me to articulate what hasn't already been said about it as far as the positives go, but this actually might upset some people out there who say that this is their favorite Star Wars movie in the entire franchise. Because I'm going to say this right off the bat, I do understand why people say it's their favorite, and I will agree that it is a great movie, but honestly, it's never really been my favorite. I know what some of you may be thinking. This guy is insane. What is he smoking? I'll go into more detail later on, but in no way do I think this is a bad movie. Way far from it. This is a great movie. But as I said, I'll explain in more detail why it hasn't been my favorite. So after the success of Star Wars A New Hope, Star Wars became a huge phenomenon, and it ushered in the age of the average everyday movie fanboy, me obviously being one of those people. And back then in the late 70s, early 80s, due to its success, naturally, people were excited and curious to see what the sequel was going to be about. Not like today where we have the internet and you could possibly know the entire plot going in. Nobody even knew what this movie was going to be about. If you were part of some kind of a fan club, or maybe you saw an article of it in the newspaper, that was probably the best that you could get as far as getting any kind of information about The Empire Strikes Back leading up to its release. Only this time, even though that George Lucas is still credited as the original creator, he allowed other people to come onto the project. A man named Irvin Kershner came on to direct The Empire Strikes Back. And I have to say, he did a great job with this one. With some of the imagery, which I'll mention later, the camera angles, the wide shots of the battles, and the lightsaber fights, he did an amazing job with this one. God rest your soul, Mr. Kershner. So The Empire Strikes Back takes place about 3 years after the events of A New Hope. Even though the Death Star has been destroyed by now, the rebels have been pursued by the Empire off of the planet Yavin, and they're now hiding out on a remote planet called Hoth, and the Empire is on a hunt to find them. Not to mention that Darth Vader is looking for Luke Skywalker in particular. So after the opening crawl, the camera moves down and focuses on the Star Destroyer, which sends out a whole bunch of Imperial probe droids throughout the galaxy, and one ends up on the planet Hoth where the rebel base is at, and out from the snow comes an Imperial probe droid, floating around looking for any signs of rebel activity. As opposed to the exciting and thrilling opening of A New Hope, this one is a complete 180 turn. You immediately get the feeling that something is wrong here. It's a very dark and dreary and not exactly pleasant opening kind of feel. Now, with any second installment in a 3-movie trilogy, naturally the second chapter is going to be darker than the first one, but this film does it in a very tasteful kind of way. And the opening is just one example of how it goes about it. And then it cuts to Luke riding around on what's called a Tauntaun, doing routine patrols outside of the rebel base. He spots the Imperial probe droid coming down and its console crashing into the ground. He lets Han Solo know that he's gonna go check it out, but then all of a sudden he gets ambushed by a Wampa creature, which drags him to its cave. Meanwhile, Han, who's doing a similar patrol routine, shows back up at Echo Base and informs a commanding general, General Riken, that he has to leave in order to pay off his debts to Jabba the Hutt. And Princess Leia doesn't really like that too much. Even though she denies it, it's pretty clear that she has feelings for the guy. Now, despite its dark tone, The Empire Strikes Back does have its moments of levity, and it's mostly through the dialogue. Of course, it comes from C-3PO and Chewbacca and R2-D2, but a lot of it has to do with the dialogue exchanges between Han and Leia, and how they eventually grow to become a couple, despite the fact of being opposed to each other earlier on.
Fredo's gonna leave without giving you a goodbye kiss?
I just assumed he's a Wookiee.
I can arrange that. You could use a good kiss!
Not to mention this part.
You stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder!
Who's scruffy looking?
Must have hit it pretty close to the mark to get her all riled up like that, huh, kid? Now, since I mentioned that, let's just say Leia kissing Luke. Watching this movie last night, still, I thought, oh, no! And the fact that Luke does this, if you only knew. Ugh. But to go back a little bit, Han gets word that Luke hasn't showed up yet from his routine patrol, and after talking with some of the personnel who still haven't heard from him, Han decides to grab a Tauntaun and go out into the wilderness to find him.
Tauntaun will freeze before you reach the first marker.
Then I'll see you in hell.
And then it cuts to Luke hanging upside down inside the cave, with that Wampa creature still walking around somewhere inside. And it's a really cool moment when he sees his lightsaber close enough to where he could reach it, but it's still too far away, and he uses the Force to get it back. It shows you Luke's progression and how far he's come in this trilogy at this point. He's not quite there yet, but he's definitely on his way to becoming a Jedi. And to go back a little bit more to the opening, when we saw him talking with Han over the radio, you get a good sense of how much more experienced he is, despite the fact that he gets in trouble here and there throughout the film. But he manages to cut himself free with his lightsaber, cuts off the Wampa's arm, and runs out of the cave into the blizzard. And then after a while, he collapses to the ground, unable to take the cold. Obi-Wan's Force Ghost appears, telling him to go to the Dagobah system to learn from Yoda. And then Han shows up, just in time to find Luke. After his Tauntaun dies from the cold, he manages to save Luke by cutting open the Tauntaun and putting Luke inside. And I have to admit, after seeing The Revenant last year, with the scene where Leo has to bury himself inside the dead horse, I couldn't help but think of that scene where Han goes,
I thought they smelled bad on the outside.
Yeah, that's... ugh. And then eventually Rogue Squadron goes out on a rescue mission, finds Han and Luke, and brings them back to Echo Base. But then soon, not long after, they get discovered by the Imperial probe droid that landed on the planet earlier. And the probe droid sound, I think, is one of the most iconic parts of the Star Wars saga. And for some reason, it still gives me chills hearing that sound, especially when you see the people's responses listening to that sound.
Wait, there's something very weak coming through.
You gotta imagine they're going like, what the heck is that? And then it cuts to the Imperial fleet, which introduces the classic Imperial March theme. We all know how that theme goes. I mean, it's become a staple in pop culture. And some people have it as a ringtone for a certain person that they don't really like, or maybe that they're annoyed by. And I have to admit, I have that ringtone from my dad whenever he calls. I'm sorry, Dad. I still love you. And not just to mention, the way the shadows go over the Imperial Star Destroyers as they're flying over each other as the music plays. Oh, man. And the fact that you could still hear a variation of that theme in the recent Last Jedi trailer, enough said. And one of the Imperial officers gets the feed from the Imperial probe droid that spotted the rebel base and reports it to his commanding officer, and later on Darth Vader, who then orders the fleet to mobilize to the Hoth system. And once they arrive too close to the planet, which causes the rebels to spring up their protective shield to keep them from coming in. And a lot of it has to do with the incompetence of their commanding admiral, who thought that surprise was wiser for some reason. And Vader is not really happy about that. In fact, after he orders the general to get his troops ready, he goes to his TV behind his isolation chamber of sorts.
Lord Vader, the fleet has moved down to flight speed and we're preparing to...
You have failed me for the last time, Admiral.
And right on the spot, the captain who showed him the feed earlier, Vader promotes him to Admiral of the Imperial fleet, while the previous Admiral is on his dying breath. And that's another thing, Vader is a lot more dangerous than he was in the first one. You saw what he was capable of in the first one, but this time, there's no Grand Moff Tarkin to keep him on a leash. If you do something wrong in even the slightest way, he's gonna kill you. And if you upset him in any other way, and I have to admit, I feel very sorry for any Imperial officer who have to report to Darth Vader. You can cross that off for any potential careers. Another thing that this movie does well is not just having a darker tone, but also, as many people have pointed out, it expands further and further on the characters, taking them to new places, exploring different aspects of them that we never would have known beforehand. Darth Vader, as I've said, is a lot more dangerous. Luke goes to even more emotional places in this one, and Han is even pushed to the emotional limits in this one also. Just like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2 or The Dark Knight, you get more of a character-driven story in this one. But then the movie goes to the Battle of Hoth, where you see these Imperial walkers called the AT-ATs, or as the technical term, the All-Terrain Armored Transport Walkers, move in on Echo Base. And even though the rebels are vastly outnumbered by these things, they have to hold them off just long enough for the rebel transports to escape to a safe location. And I'm sure other people have said it before, it is definitely one of the best battle sequences ever put in the saga. From the music by John Williams, which is still as great as ever, from the speeders flying in, putting their tow cables around the legs, and the fact that this was referenced in Captain America Civil War. Yeah. And the effects on the Imperial walkers themselves, the fact that there's stop motion movements, it still holds up nearly 40 years later. This movie's 37 years old at the time of this recording. It still looks great. And from what I understand, the filmmakers took inspiration from elephants' legs moving around, and they used that to incorporate it into the Imperial Walkers' movements. And you can definitely see that in the way they move their legs. Front leg, back leg, front leg, back leg. So eventually the shield generator for the rebels gets destroyed and all the remaining personnel have to flee. Han Solo tries to get Leia out on a rebel transport but decides to get her out on the Falcon when their escape route is cut off, while Luke finds his way back to his X-Wing fighter to take off for Dagobah. And one of my favorite lines from Han when he says to 3PO as they're running towards the Falcon.
Hurry up, Conrad! You're gonna be a permanent resident!
Wait!
Han doesn't have any patience for 3PO's worry-wardedness, if that's the way to say it. 3PO is a little annoying in this one, but the right kind of annoying. Kind of like John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. A funny kind of annoying. But even so, still, it's like, dude, shut up. So they take off in the Falcon, but they're still being pursued by the Imperial fleet. And I'm probably going to keep saying this, but another thing that this movie does perfectly is the title, The Empire Strikes Back. The Empire literally does strike back. The rebels lose yet another base, but also the Millennium Falcon doesn't work. The hyperdrive, which is helpful to go into hyperspace, badly damaged. So there is no way these guys can escape the way they want to. And not only does it show the sheer force and size of the Imperial military, despite the fact that they lost the Death Star, but it also shows just how vulnerable the characters are, and that they could be blown away at any minute. In the asteroid scene, and John Williams' music once again has a lot to do with that. From the two Star Destroyers nearly crashing into each other.
Take evasive action!
Oh, by the way, that Imperial alarm, I have that from my sister's text tone. Sorry, sis. And also to them flying into the asteroid field, my mouth hangs open every time. And the reactions of the characters to go into this asteroid field, totally authentic. Even though Han still puts on a brave face, he clearly still doesn't like the idea of flying into this field. But hey, desperate times, right? So they manage to thwart off the TIE fighters, and they land deep inside this hole on this one asteroid. Yet they still don't know if this is the right move to make, because they got no idea what's down underneath there. Meanwhile, Luke manages to make his way to the Dagobah system, crashing it into this swampy area, and R2 almost gets eaten up alive by this some kind of a swamp creature that swims around in the water. I have no idea what that is. But luckily enough, it spits R2 out like, yeah, I'm not gonna eat a robot, I can't eat that. As Luke says,
You're lucky you don't taste very good.
and one of my favorite lighthearted moments in this movie is when after R2 falls into the water and his periscope pops out and he's trying to find a way out and Luke goes,
R2, that way.
So Luke and R2 set up camp as they plan to search for Yoda. But then Yoda shows up. And speaking of Yoda, what else can I say about this guy? Because Frank Oz's puppetry and his voice work, it's been said before, but I'm probably going to repeat more or less the same stuff anyway. When you first meet Yoda, small, old, weird, and slow. I mean, I can imagine him living on that planet for so long, that would obviously take a toll on your mind. But at this point, Luke doesn't even know that this is Yoda yet, and he brings Luke to his home to give him some dinner. But really, he's just testing Luke to see just how patient he is. Going into his stuff, throwing stuff around, eating his food, to the point where Luke goes,
No, I don't even know what I'm doing here. We're wasting our time.
and then finally, he reveals who he is. The boy has no patience. He will learn patience. Was I any different when you taught me? And despite Yoda's hesitation to train Luke, he reluctantly agrees to train him. I won't fail you. I'm not afraid. You will be. You will be. Now, I said earlier that this movie has never really been my favorite. This is the part that I'm talking about. Going back and forth from Luke and Yoda on Dagobah to Han and Leia on the Falcon, this is where I feel like the movie kind of drags a little bit. I feel like the pacing goes up and down and how it moves forward. I mostly would fast forward through this part because I found it kind of boring to sit through. Now as an adult, I could sit through it and appreciate it, especially the Luke and Yoda scenes, because it definitely adds a lot for Luke's character. But still, going back and forth, I feel like it kind of drags a little bit. I found myself getting just a little bit bored. Again, I'm not saying that this is a bad movie. Far from it. Way far from it, actually. But I feel like going back and forth from one point to another, I feel like the movie kind of slows down a little bit. Almost to the point where it just becomes a little bit boring to sit through. And the passages of time aren't exactly really clear. Just how long has Luke been training? Maybe it's for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. It's not really clear in the film. Then again, like I said, the scenes are well done. I think I could let it slide. But it's in the sequence with his training on Dagobah that not only does he grow closer to being a Jedi, but we also see just how still weak of a man he is. He fails at everything. And the scene in the cave, which as a kid, obviously I didn't get what all that was about. But it makes a lot more sense upon retrospect, seeing the entire trilogy and the entire saga. But after doing some running, Yoda puts him under this weird hallucination. And I think most people would agree that this is meant to be a foreshadowing of not only revealing Vader's true identity, but also warning Luke, don't go down this path. You could end up just like Vader. So he goes into the cave with his weapons despite Yoda telling him not to bring them in there. He goes down into the cave and he sees Darth Vader. And they have a brief lightsaber fight. Luke cuts off Vader's head, falls to the ground, and then the mask explodes open, revealing Luke's face underneath that mask. And Luke's face says it all. What the heck is all this? And then later on, his confidence is tested when he tries to lift the X-Wing out of the water, which sinks to the bottom of the water. As he sees that it's sinking, he starts going, oh man, we're never gonna get this out. Do or do not. There is no try. Luke tries to lift it out of the water, almost gets out, but no. And he beats himself up saying, I can't do it, it's too big, I can't lift it. And Yoda gives him this speech about the Force. Judge me by my size, do you? And where you should not. For my ally is the Force.
Between you, me, the tree, the rock, everywhere. Yes.
For some reason when he says that, the way the music cues up and hearing the creatures chirping in the distance, it touches the kid inside me somewhere. Not only that, but these are the kind of lessons that you could learn in life in general, that you could teach young kids, especially young boys about. Because that's another thing. I've heard a lot of people complain that Luke is even more of a whiny brat in this one. If you had that much riding on your shoulders, you're the last young Force user out there in the galaxy, and you have all this pressure on your shoulders to bring back the Jedi Order, and you're in this desolate planet with very little supplies, and you have all this mental pressure being pushed on you by this wise old Jedi, odds are you're going to be complaining a little bit. As someone who's served in the military and has gone through basic training and has been pushed to similar limits like that, I know exactly how that feels. And put yourself in his position. Would you be all stoic and tough like you would say you would be? You may say that, yeah, I would, but let's be honest, you wouldn't. Again, it makes sense for the story and where his character growth is in this one, so I'm okay with him complaining a little bit in this one. And again, if you can't handle just a little bit of complaining, well, I'm sorry, your tolerance level, a lot lower than mine is. But despite Yoda's speech to Luke, he storms off calling him the impossible, and Yoda manages to lift up the X-Wing out of the water with complete ease, to Luke's astonishment, and it leads to this.
I don't believe it.
That is why you fail.
Youch. And that's another thing with Luke. Not my words, but words that I've heard from other people. Luke does believe in the Force, and you can see that he does believe in it, and he knows that it's there, but the thing that's holding him back is that he doesn't have enough confidence in himself to believe in it, which is exactly why he wasn't able to lift the X-Wing out of the water. And as someone who decided to give his life to God in the last year or so, I can relate to that. Meanwhile, back on the Falcon, Han, Leia, and Chewie and 3PO are trying to make repairs to the Falcon, and a romance starts to blossom between Han and Leia despite their continuing to bicker with each other. Don't get excited. Captain, being held by you is quite enough to get me excited. Sorry, sweetheart. And then it has another one of my favorite lines between Han and 3PO.
Not entirely stable. I'm glad you're here to tell us these things. Chewie, take the professor in the back and plug him into the hyperdrive.
But it's not until after a couple of creatures called Minox start eating away at the Falcon that they manage to scare away, that the asteroid starts to shake and vibrate, that Han decides to take off and escape. And it turns out that they weren't just hiding inside of an asteroid. They were hiding inside a space slug which nearly eats them as they escape. And apparently that's called a exogorth? Yeah. Oh, since I mentioned earlier with Luke seeing his face inside Darth Vader's helmet, this movie also foreshadows what's coming, as to what you're going to learn about the characters. Another example is when you see Darth Vader unmasked from behind his head. Admiral Piet comes in to inform Darth Vader of the situation, and we see Darth Vader's helmet being placed on his head, and you see his head all scarred and charred up. And it's one of those things where you go, so he doesn't wear that for show. He needs that helmet. He's a damaged person. That's interesting. And watching the movie last night, I couldn't help but notice the way his head was all scrunched up like that against his shoulders. It's almost like Vader was saying, yeah, what do you want? And then you also see a conversation between Vader and the Emperor, the leader of the Galactic Empire, and that's the only person that keeps Vader on a leash. Vader may be a key figure in the Empire, and he may be the one calling all the shots when it comes to Imperial military force, but he does answer to somebody else. The Emperor. Now this is not Ian McDiarmid in this one. This is actually a lady disguised as an old scarred man. And there was some kind of a voiceover that they used for this scene, and they lip synced it together to match up the lady's mouth movements. They did a pretty good job with it. And they're talking about Luke Skywalker and how whether or not he can be turned. And then back on Dagobah, as Luke continues to train, he starts to see visions of Han and Leia being tortured, and he decides that he has to go out and save them. And Yoda's like, no, don't you dare, it's too dangerous. And even Obi-Wan's ghost shows up again to say, Luke, he's right. Listen to him. This is the Emperor and Darth Vader trying to get their claws into you. Don't do this. But even so, Luke says, no. I have to do this. I promise. I'll come back. You're not going to lose me. And then there comes another hint.
That boy is our last hope.
No. There is another.
What does that mean? Another Force user? Another Skywalker? So while Luke takes off to find Han and Leia manage to escape from the Imperial fleet and head off to this planet called Bespin in order to meet up with Han's old friend, Lando Calrissian, who could possibly help him repair the Falcon. Lando Calrissian is played by Billy D. Williams, and when these two guys meet, you do get a pretty good sense of them being old buddies, but there's a sense of uncertainty and distrust with this guy. And at first, Lando doesn't seem really happy to see him, but then all of a sudden he starts saying, hey, how you doing, y'all pirates? So good to see you again. And then when he sees Leia, he's turning on those Mr. Smooth kind of guy. And who might you be, my dear? You belong with us among the clouds. Okay, slam your brakes, dude. And everything seems to be going okay, despite the fact that 3PO gets separated from the others and gets shot by this unknown creature. It's kind of like in The Prisoner of Azkaban, where you see that hotel mate go, housekeeping, and the door opens and some creature screeching at her from the inside, and she goes, yep, not today. Just like that, I've always wondered, who and what exactly was that who shot 3PO? Despite all that, everything seems to be going okay with Lando until one day he invites Han, Leia, and Chewie to go to dinner with him, and then all of a sudden the doors open, and you see Darth Vader standing at the end of the table, and Han pulls out his blaster and starts shooting at him. Vader blocks it, yanks the pistol away from him with the Force, and then out comes Boba Fett, whom Darth Vader hired earlier to find Han Solo. And speaking of Boba Fett, he is ranked as one of the best characters in Star Wars. Yeah, maybe in some book you read, but not in a movie. Now, don't get me wrong, guys, I don't dislike Boba Fett or anything, but he doesn't really do anything in the movies. He just walks around saying, he's no good to me dead. Put Captain Solo in the cargo hold. Again, maybe in some comic book or some novel, he's probably a lot more interesting, but in this movie and The Return of the Jedi, no, not really, no, sorry. But I do like when Darth Vader's talking to these other bounty hunters, he points out to Boba Fett, no disintegrations. As I'm sure other people have said, it's a perfect sum up that Boba Fett has a reputation and Darth Vader's aware of it. Yeah, I know exactly how you operate, dude. Don't do anything stupid. I need them alive. And it's really easy to give Lando a lot of crap for betraying his friends, but if you really think about it, can you imagine the conversation that went down between him and Darth Vader? You don't hand me over your friend, I'm gonna bring every single one of my guys in here, and they're gonna torture the ever-living crap out of your citizens. And we'll see just how noble and brave you really are. Put yourself in his position. What would you do? And then when we see the torture scene where Han Solo gets branded, I guess, the Empire is just very, very brutal and just how far they're willing to go. They are a military force that you do not want to mess with. And this movie shows. They're basically space Nazis. I mean, besides the uniforms and the way they're called stormtroopers and the dome-shaped helmets and everything, you can definitely tell that they are like the Nazis in the Star Wars universe. And the Nazis were probably the closest to an empire that we ever had in modern history. And Darth Vader's doing all this so Luke can have the visions of Han and Leia getting tortured, so he'll come over to rescue them, and Darth Vader will get the drop on him and turn him over to the dark side. Not only is Darth Vader more evil and more sinister, he's actually very clever and he knows exactly what he's doing. And he also orders Han Solo to be frozen in carbonite because he plans to do the same thing to Luke, and if it doesn't work, well, No need to throw Luke into there. And I will talk about this later on, but it shows you that he does care about Luke. There is some good inside Darth Vader. Yet on the other hand, he doesn't care about Han Solo at all. If he ends up dying in the carbon freeze, well, good riddance, I suppose. And this scene where Han Solo gets frozen, from Chewie lashing out on the stormtroopers to Han and Leia sharing a kiss and Leia saying,
I love you.
I know.
and seeing Han get frozen like that and Leia's response to it, emotions, man. I almost cried. It was... oh, man. Thankfully, Han Solo ends up surviving the freezing process. Boba Fett is free to take Han Solo back to Jabba the Hutt, but Vader tells Lando, take the princess and the Wookiee to my ship. You said they'd be left into the city under my supervision. I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further. So Luke finally shows up and tries to make his way over to Han and Leia, as Han's being taken away to Boba Fett's ship. But then Luke finds himself inside the carbon chamber, and this leads into one of the greatest confrontations of all time. The lack of music, the dark shadows, the door closing on the floor, Luke looking around, looking at his blaster, putting it away, basically with him saying, this is not gonna do me any good in here. And when Darth Vader comes out and says,
The Force is with you, young Skywalker. But you are not a Jedi yet.
and then Luke walks up the stairs to Vader, pulls out his lightsaber. Vader pulls out his. The sounds of the lightsaber and the camera focusing on Luke's face who's ready for a fight. Chills every single time. Wow. And there's another thing that I noticed in this scene, the imagery in here, and particularly this shot, it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. The way Vader's costume looks in the shadows among the light in the distance, oh man, I love that. I love it. Meanwhile, Lando reveals to Leia and Chewie that he's actually trying to help them save Han. Despite their initial resistance, they agree to work together to go save Han Solo. But it's too late. So they end up running through Cloud City, warning everybody of what's going on, and they manage to escape on the Falcon. And R2 reunites with C-3PO, who's still under some kind of a repairs. And not to go too much onto these special edition changes, but some of the changes that I do like is when you see some of the extra outdoor shots of Cloud City. It makes it feel more like a real place. It doesn't feel claustrophobic like it does in the original cut. And back to the fight between Luke and Vader. The fight gets even more intense and more thrilling. With Vader toying with Luke, you have learned much, young one. You'll find that I'm full of surprises. And I just love how Vader just does not care at all. And at one point he's holding the lightsaber with his one hand, just swinging away, blocking Luke's saber. It's like, come on, dude. You got nothing on me. And especially when Luke falls into the pit. Yep, all too easy. Perhaps you're not as strong as the Emperor thought. But Luke shows that he's a lot more capable than he seems. And as the fight goes on through the other parts, Luke continues to put up more of a fight. And then finally, when he reaches the last walkway, Vader just pops out from behind a wall and is swinging and swinging away as hard as he can. It's like, oh boy, this is not good. Just the way he's swinging at him and the heavy breathing that you hear, that's basically him saying, all right, kid, I'm through playing around. This is business. And he cuts off Luke's hand, has him cornered, and he tries to plead with him. With our combined strength, we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy. I'll never join you. At this point with everything, the rebels have lost Echo Base, Han Solo's been frozen in carbonite, Luke has failed every single challenge that has been posed to him by Yoda. Could this get any worse? Well, now that you mentioned it, Vader decides to drop a big bomb on not just Luke, but the audience, with the greatest twist of all time.
No. I am your father.
Not true. That's impossible.
I can sort of remember the first time I saw this moment, but I don't remember what my reaction was. But I have seen countless videos on YouTube with young kids watching it for the first time and going, really? Really? And I've heard stories from people that when they saw it for the first time in 1980, they were freaked out by that revelation. Like, no way.
Wait, what?
I am your father.
Darth Vader is Luke's father?
Again, I wish I could be a fly on the wall, seeing people's responses to that scene. And for those of you who don't know, Mark Hamill actually was one of the few people who knew about that reveal. In fact, he's even said in interviews.
Irvin Kershner brought me aside and said, look, you're gonna know this, George knows this, and I know this. You can't tell anybody, but here's what the real story is.
And even leading up to The Force Awakens, he told the story of how he was sitting next to Harrison Ford during the premiere of Empire Strikes Back, and how he talked about his response to it.
I still remember when we saw the first screening, Harrison turned to me and said, "You never told me that." I said, "I know, but I would have gotten in trouble if I told you."
I've always found that really interesting, and how he managed to keep that a secret in a world where not even the internet was a thing back then, because I can imagine if this movie came out today, it would be a lot harder for that secret to have been kept. Not to mention that the original reveal was going to be that Obi-Wan killed Luke's father. And I always wondered, how would the movies have turned out if that was the case? I mean, it would have been interesting, that's for sure. But in the end, I'm glad that they went with Darth Vader being Luke's dad, because it made it a lot more impactful. And you could definitely feel Luke's terror and pain at this revelation. It's like, is he bluffing? Could he be? And the way the music goes, da 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 da. I don't think he's bluffing, man. I think he really is his father. And after more offering from Darth Vader saying, "Come with me, Luke. It is the only way," Luke decides to willingly kill himself by dropping down into the abyss. But then he gets sucked into this air vent and lands up on one of the railings on the bottom of Cloud City. At first he starts to call out to Ben, but as Ben Kenobi stated earlier, if you choose to face Vader, do it alone. I can't interfere. Realizing that he's not going to get any help from Obi-Wan, he starts to call out to Leia by using the Force. And Leia hears him and turns the ship around to go and save Luke. Again, another hint that, could Leia be the other that Yoda mentioned? So Leia, Lando, and Chewie manage to save Luke while still being pursued by TIE fighters. Vader returns to his Imperial Star Destroyer, and the Falcon barely manages to escape, but not before Vader tries to reach out to Luke through the Force. "Son, come with me." And Luke is still upset over this revelation. "Ben, why didn't you tell me?" But thanks to R2, they manage to escape on the Falcon. And at first, Admiral Piet is really scared since he told Darth Vader that they deactivated the hyperdrive. At first, he looks like he's about ready to die, but Darth Vader just walks right past him, not even saying a word. I always wondered, what? Why didn't he choke him? Maybe he liked him too much? Who the heck knows? And then the movie ends with Luke getting a new prosthetic hand while on the ship called the Frigate Redemption. Yes, I am a big nerd, I'm sorry. Lando and Chewie are ready to take off on the Falcon to go find Han, and Luke tells him over the radio, "You let me know what happens and I'll meet you there." And despite the fact that this movie ends on a pretty low note, there's still a sense of hope that everything's gonna be okay. As Luke, Leia, and the rest of the gang look out into the galaxy as they see the Falcon taking off towards Tatooine, it's a mixture of like despair, but also a slight sense of hope for the characters. And then the movie ends. And I've heard from various people that not too many people were happy that this movie ended on a cliffhanger, knowing that they had to wait 3 more years to finally get the answers. Now, having grown up with the VHS tapes as a kid, I thankfully didn't have to go through that, but I kind of have to now with this new trilogy. But thankfully it's only 2 years. But still, I don't doubt that people were upset about that. Like, no! And I guess it's surprising that this movie initially got a mixed response upon its release. There was definitely people who still loved it and really enjoyed it, but there was also a group of people that came out of it saying, "What the heck did I just watch?" And critics weren't exactly keen on it either. They were very mixed, as I said earlier. But of course, over time, as more people have gone back and watched it, and after The Return of the Jedi came out, more people have started to appreciate it and now consider it a classic. As I said, Empire Strikes Back is not exactly my favorite due to the midsection being kind of slow, but nevertheless, I do get why people say it's their favorite, and I will not hesitate to call it a great movie. So those are my thoughts on The Empire Strikes Back. Thank you guys for watching this. I'm really enjoying talking about Star Wars as we're getting closer to The Last Jedi, which cannot come any sooner. Anyway, so stay tuned for my review of Return of the Jedi, my favorite next to The Force Awakens in the entire saga. I cannot wait to talk about that. Let me know down below what you think of The Empire Strikes Back. Do you love it? Like it? Think it's alright? Or do you dislike it or hate it? Either way, tell me what your thoughts are, and I will see you guys next time.